What's up, everybody? This is Harley, and welcome back to another episode of the Unapologetically Spicy Podcast, the Blackity podcast about the layered, nuanced, and unapologetically real experiences of life as a neurodivergent Black woman. If you grew up as the golden child or felt like you had to be perfect just to survive, this one's for you. Today, we'll be talking about the perfect child mask, what it is, why so many of us wear it, and most importantly, how we can start to take it off. First, let's break down what the perfect child mask is. Simply put, it's a coping mechanism. It's a survival strategy that many of us adopted as kids, growing up in environments where we felt like we weren't allowed to be anything less than perfect. Maybe you had a parent who demanded excellence in everything: grades, behavior, achievements, or maybe you grew up walking on eggshells, trying to keep the peace in a chaotic or unpredictable household. If you listened to my previous episode on narcissistic parents, this might sound familiar. In those environments, being perfect felt like the only way to be seen, loved, or safe. The mask might have looked like straight A's, being overly responsible, or always putting other people's needs ahead of your own. But underneath that mask, there's a child who is scared, lonely, and just wanted to be loved for who they were, not what they could do. As adults, this mask often follows us into our relationships and careers. It can make it hard to connect with others authentically because we're so used to performing or proving our worth. We might struggle to ask for help, thinking that it's a sign of weakness, or avoid setting boundaries out of the fear of disappointing others. So, personal growth can feel like an uphill battle when perfectionism is whispering that nothing we do is ever enough. And that's the heartbreaking part. It robs us of the joy and the freedom that comes from embracing our true selves, imperfections, and all. Just saying those things out loud, it brings up so much. And for me personally, I wore this mask for a long time. I sometimes still wear it. But growing up, I felt this unspoken rule that I had to keep it together no matter what. It wasn't safe to cry, to mess up, or to let anyone see me struggle. And that's the thing about the perfect child mask. It teaches you to hide. So you hide your pain, your needs, even your joy sometimes, because you're so focused on being what others expect you to be. And that's exhausting, y'all. And if you grew up with a parent whose approval felt conditional, something I talked about in my last episode, the narcissistic parent one, this will resonate even deeper. So, why do we develop this mask in the first place? A lot of it goes back to childhood. If you grew up in a household with a parent who had narcissistic tendencies, or where emotional neglect was the norm, you might have learned that the only way to get love or avoid conflict was to be perfect. It's a form of self-protection or self-preservation. And here's the twist. What starts as protection eventually becomes a prison. The masks might have kept us safe as kids, but as adults, it's holding us back. It's the voice that says, you're only worthy if you're flawless. In daily life, this can show up in the workplace, where you feel the need to overwork or avoid making even minor mistakes out of fear of judgment. It can also manifest in personal relationships, where you might avoid expressing your needs to keep the peace or fear rejection if you show vulnerability. It's the reason we struggle with perfectionism, people pleasing, and setting boundaries. And let me tell you, Breaking free from all of that is a whole journey in itself. And for us Black folks, it hits different. Growing up as a Black child, especially in predominantly white spaces, the stakes felt even higher. We're often taught that we have to work twice as hard to be seen as half as good, that we can't afford to make mistakes because people are watching, waiting, waiting for us to fail. This pressure isn't just about personal excellence, it's rooted in a history of survival where perfection was often a shield against systematic racism and societal bias. The perfect child mask isn't just about family dynamics, it's about navigating a world that's stacked against us, generation after generation. For Black girls in particular, there's this pressure to be strong, to take care of everyone else, to never show weakness. We're praised for being mature for our age, but that's just code for you're handling trauma so well. And y'all, that's not a compliment. That's survival. It's passed down as a necessity in many Black families who face constant scrutiny and judgment. It's the weight of our ancestors' resilience woven into the expectations placed on us, whether spoken or unspoken. Recognizing this intergenerational context helps us understand why breaking free from the mask feels so hard and why it's so important for our healing and liberation. I remember being told things like, "You're so well behaved," or "You're such a good example," as if my worth was tied to how much I could perform for others. But what about the times I wasn't okay? When I needed help? In those moments, I felt invisible because that perfect child mask, it doesn't leave room for vulnerability. And let's not forget how this ties into respectability politics. In case you don't know what that is, it basically refers to a set of unspoken rules that dictate how marginalized groups are expected to behave in order to be seen as acceptable or deserving of respect by the dominant culture. It's the idea that if we dress a certain way, speak a certain way, or even act a certain way, we'll be safe from prejudice or discrimination. Let's take an example, or let's think of a couple of examples. Think about how Black professionals are often told that we need to tone down our natural hairstyles in the workplace to appear more professional. Like when there was a point in time you were able to Google unprofessional hairstyles, and a lot of Black women's hairstyles would pop up. Here's another example. Think about how Black children are disciplined more harshly in schools for behaviors that wouldn't be scrutinized in their white peers. Historically, during the civil rights movement, leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. emphasized polished appearances and measured behavior to gain respect and sympathy from a society steeped in racism. While those strategies were necessary for survival, they also reinforced the message that our humanity is conditional upon meeting impossible standards. That may have sounded really preachy, but the reality is, no amount of respectability can protect us from systematic racism or bias. These standards are rooted in white supremacy and often serve to police and erase our authentic selves. They tell us that we can't be too loud, too expressive, too much of anything that might challenge the status quo. It's exhausting and it's not fair. Let's think about it. How do we take the mask off? How do we start to unlearn this idea that we have to be perfect to be loved? I know it's not easy, but it is possible. Here are a few things that helped me on my journey. Number one, say it with me now, therapy. Y'all already know I'm a big advocate for therapy. Working with a therapist has been life changing for me. It's a safe space to unpack all the beliefs I've carried for so long and start rewriting my narrative. If you've been following my podcast, you know that therapy has been key in helping me understand my relationship with my mother and the ways it shaped me. Self-compassion. This one's hard, but it's so necessary. Whenever that little voice of perfectionism creeps in, I try to remind myself, you're human. You're allowed to mess up. You're still worthy. 3. Setting boundaries. Learning to say no, to put myself first, and to let people see the real me has been scary, but so freeing. Boundaries aren't just about keeping others out. They're also about protecting your peace. 4. Celebrating imperfection. One thing I've started doing is intentionally embracing imperfection. Whether it's leaving typos in a text or showing up to a meeting without over preparing, these little acts remind me that I don't have to be perfect to be enough. 5. Reconnecting with joy. Sometimes we get so caught up in the doing that we forget how to just be. And for me, that can look like dancing around my room, laughing until my stomach hurts, and embracing the parts of me that feel free and untamed. So if any of this resonates with you, I want you to know that you're not alone. That perfect child mask might have helped you to survive, but it doesn't have to define the rest of your life. You are so much more than your achievements, your productivity, or your ability to hold it together. And if no one has told you this today, let me be the first. You are worthy just as you are, messy, imperfect, and human. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Unapologetically Spicy podcast. I hope it gave you some things to think about and maybe even inspired to help you start taking off your own mask. If this episode spoke to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. So share your stories with me on social media or leave a review wherever you're listening. Let's keep this conversation going. That being said, make sure you follow the Unapologetically Spicy podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcast fix. Follow the podcast on Instagram at unapologeticallyspicypod or on X, formerly known as Twitter, at unapolospicypod. Want to talk about the podcast online? Use hashtag unapologeticallyspicypod to start the conversation. Leave a comment on the show's page on Spotify or leave a review on our official Facebook page. Until next time, take care of yourselves and remember, you're allowed to be real, raw, and spicy, unapologetic.